There is a moment just before full wakefulness when the mind hovers between what is real and what is imagined. The sounds of the world around you are distant, muffled, neither here nor entirely gone. You are somewhere soft and unreachable, suspended in time without a clock, without an alarm, without any particular obligation to know what hour it is or what the day demands. In that moment, you belong only to yourself. For most of recorded history, that feeling was not a luxury. It was simply life. The people of medieval Britain did not experience time the way we do. They did not wake to the sound of a buzzing device on a nightstand. They did not check messages before their feet touched the floor. They did not open a screen that showed them the weight of the world at 7 in the morning before they had eaten a single bite of bread. Their mornings began differently. Their days unfolded at a pace we would struggle to recognize. And the shape of their hours, the texture of their work, the rhythm of their rest. All of it was bound not to a grid of appointments and deadlines, but to something far older. The turning of light, the arrival of cold, the sound of a bell carried on wind. Tonight we are going to live a day in medieval Britain. Not the version invented by cinema, full of dramatic sieges and throne room betrayals. Not the sanitized pageant of knights in gleaming armor or the caricature of miserable peasants knee-deep in mud. We are going to live the quiet version, the real version, the one that almost no one tells. We are going to wake before sunrise in a thatched cottage somewhere in the English countryside, perhaps in the 12th century, perhaps the 13th, and we are going to follow the hours as they actually passed. Through labor and prayer and food and fire and cold stone and rough linen and the particular kind of silence that only exists when there are no engines in the world. We will visit the monastery at dawn and the market at midday and the Lord's great hall by evening. We will follow women carrying water, monks copying manuscripts, children learning trades, and farmers reading the sky like a language they were born speaking. This is a history for the quiet hours, for the moments when the noise of the present grows too loud and you need to remember that the world has always been older and stranger and more patient than any single life within it. The people of medieval Britain are gone, but the shape of their days remains. Pressed into parish records and illuminated manuscripts, and the foundations of churches, still standing in villages so old their names predate the Norman tongue. Close your eyes if you like, or let them rest somewhere soft and unfocused. We begin at the edge of morning, in the dark, on the cold side of a medieval dawn. If you have been finding comfort in this channel, please consider subscribing. History for Sleep exists to give your mind a quiet place to land. History told slowly, without urgency, without alarm. If tonight's journey serves you, share it with someone who also needs a gentler kind of rest. And now, back to medieval Britain, and the long, unhurried hours of a day that began before the sun. The sky outside the cottage is not yet light. It is the particular darkness that comes just before the first grey suggestion of morning, a darkness that has weight to it, that sits on the land like a held breath. Inside the cottage, there is no window in the modern sense. There is an opening in the wall, perhaps covered with a wooden shutter, perhaps with oiled cloth stretched thin enough to let a little pallid light through. The floor is earthen, packed hard by years of footsteps, scattered with dried rushes and perhaps some herbs, meadowsweet or pennyroyal, or simply whatever grew near the fence and smelled green when crushed. In the centre of the room, or close to one wall, there is a hearth, not a fireplace with a chimney, not in most village homes of the early medieval period, simply a hearth, a low ring of stones on the earthen floor, and above it the slow breath of banked coals. The family sleeps together. This is not poverty, not quite. It is warmth, and it is the architecture of a world without central heating, without radiators, without the invisible miracle of pipes carrying warmth through walls. In winter, the body heat of several people sleeping close is not nothing. It is, in fact, essential. A single person alone in that room on a January night in 12th century England would understand cold in a way that most of us have never had occasion to learn. The sleeping arrangements vary by status and period, but in the typical village household, a peasant family holding a virgate of land, perhaps 15 to 30 acres, working some of it for themselves and some of it for their lord. The family sleeps on straw pallets on the floor, or perhaps on a low wooden frame stuffed with straw or dried grass. The mattress, as we know it, with its springs and its foam and its precise calibrated firmness, does not exist. But straw, properly packed and regularly replaced, is not as uncomfortable as it sounds. It holds warmth, it gives under the body, it smells faintly of the fields, which is to say, it smells like home. The household goods of a typical peasant family, if inventoried, and such inventories do occasionally appear in legal records in the aftermath of death or debt, present a picture of material life stripped to its functional essentials. A cooking pot or two, a wooden bowl for each member of the family, spoons of horn or wood. Perhaps a knife, the one tool that almost everyone in medieval Britain carries on their person as a matter of course, used for eating, for work, for cutting rope and leather and thread and the 100 other tasks and that require a blade. A wooden chest for the family's best possessions. The spare garment, the few coins if any. The documents of land tenure if the family holds them. Blankets and coverings made from rough wool. A stool, perhaps a table or trestle board. The agricultural tools, the plough parts, the spade, the scythe, kept separately in the byre or the yard. This is not poverty in the absolute sense. It is sufficiency. Everything that is needed and nothing that is not, in a world where the making and maintenance of every object requires a significant investment of time and skill. The woman of the household typically rises first. This is documented in enough sources, from court records to monastic descriptions of village life to the moral literature of the period, that it can be stated with reasonable confidence. She rises in the dark. She stirs the coals. She adds fuel, dried peat, or wood if the family has access to the forest, or dried animal dung in regions where wood is scarce. She blows on the coals until they glow and catch, and she watches the fire come back to life in the darkroom. And for a moment, the whole world is just that. A woman, a fire, and the quiet before the day begins. There is no coffee. This is worth pausing on, because the morning stimulant is so deeply embedded in modern life that removing it from the imagination of morning feels almost like removing a sense. There is ale, which is what most people in medieval Britain drank instead of water, not because they were inclined toward intoxication, but because ale, even weak ale, the table ale or small ale, brewed for daily consumption, was safer than water from the local stream, and it contained calories which, in a world of physical labour, were never unwanted. A bowl of pottage, which is to say, a thick porridge or stew made of whatever grain and vegetables were available, might be eaten in the morning. Oats, if you were in Scotland or the north of England. Barley, more commonly in the south. Dried peas, or beans, or whatever root vegetables survived the previous autumn's harvest, softened by hours of simmering, in a pot that might never be fully emptied or fully cleaned, but simply topped up with new ingredients as the days passed. The children do not wake immediately. In the cold months, they are allowed to stay under the coverings a little longer, while the mother tends the fire, and perhaps the father, if he is a man with animals to tend, steps outside into the pre-dawn dark to check on the livestock. The animals are important. In many households, they are more important than comfort, more important than convenience, more important than almost anything except the lives of the children themselves. A cow, a few sheep, a pig. These are not pets. They are capital. They are the difference between a family that survives a bad harvest and one that does not. The care of animals is therefore the first task of the morning, every morning, without exception, including feast days, including days when a man is sick, including days when the weather is so brutal that stepping outside feels like stepping into a punishment. So the father, let us call him by the generic name the records suggest, the villains and serfs and free tenants who made up the majority of medieval Britain's rural population, rises into the dark and the cold and goes to the animals. He checks the cow. He checks that the sheep are not lying in a way that suggests illness. He checks the pig, which is probably the most valuable single animal the family owns, because the pig converts almost everything: scraps, waste, acorns, kitchen refuse, into meat and fat. And in a world without refrigeration, a pig slaughtered in autumn and preserved in salt is the protein that carries a family through the winter. He returns to the house. He eats. He drinks his ale. He prepares for the day. What that day looks like depends enormously on when in the year we are, because medieval life is seasonal in a way that modern life simply is not. The agricultural calendar is the master calendar. It supersedes everything. It shapes what work is done, how many hours are available for it, and even, to some extent, what food is eaten and what mood settles over the village. Let us place ourselves in late spring, May perhaps, or early June, because this is the period of the most intense agricultural labour and also one of the most revealing in terms of the texture of daily life. The fields are planted or about to be planted. The days are long. The light comes early and stays late. The body is pushed to its absolute limit in spring, and then again at harvest, and these two poles of effort bookend a year that also contains, somewhat surprisingly, significant stretches of relative idleness. Midwinter especially, when the frozen ground offers nothing and the light offers only a few precious hours, and the primary occupation is simply surviving until warmth returns. In May, the day begins with purpose, and the purpose is the land. The open field system, the great organizing principle of medieval English agriculture, divides the arable land around the village into 2 or 3 large fields, each of which is subdivided into long, narrow strips. Each family holds a certain number of strips distributed across the fields, not clustered together, but scattered, so that no single family monopolizes the best ground. The strips are separated not by walls or fences, but by narrow ridges of unploughed earth called balks. Walking across a medieval field is walking across a corrugated landscape, and the ridges and furrows of that corrugation are so durable that in some parts of England, where the ground was never ploughed flat by later agricultural methods, they can still be seen from the air today. Ghost fields, the imprint of a system of farming that persisted for centuries, pressed permanently into the English countryside. In May, a family with land to work is up and in the fields by the time the light permits it. The plough, if they are wealthy enough to own one, or if the village shares a plough team, which is common, is the central instrument of this labour. The medieval plough is a remarkable piece of technology, evolved over centuries from simpler scratch ploughs into a heavy, wheeled implement capable of turning the dense clay soils of Midland England that had resisted cultivation for millennia. It requires a team of oxen to pull it, sometimes 4, sometimes 8, sometimes more, depending on the heaviness of the soil, and oxen are expensive, which is why plough teams are often assembled cooperatively from several households, each contributing 1 or 2 animals to the team, and each receiving a portion of the ploughings in return. The man behind the plough guides it through the soil, feeling the resistance of the earth through the handles, watching the share cut and the moldboard turn the furrow over, brown earth rolling to the side in a long, slow wave. It is hard work. The arms tire. The back aches in a specific way that anyone who has dug in a garden for an extended period will recognize, only amplified many times over, sustained over hours rather than minutes, repeated day after day across the weeks of the ploughing season. The oxen are slow and they require management. A boy, often one of the farmer's own children, walks at the head of the team, guiding the lead animals, sometimes tapping a goad, a sharp stick, against their flanks to keep them moving in a straight line. The boy is perhaps 8 years old or 10, and he has been doing this since he was old enough to be trusted with the task. And he knows the animals by name and by temperament, knows which one pulls harder on the left and which one tires first. And this knowledge is practical, not sentimental, though sentiment is not entirely absent either. Medieval children worked. This is worth stating directly, not with the moral framing of the present, but simply as a fact of the world they inhabited. The concept of childhood as a protected period of play and education is a relatively recent invention, and in medieval Britain it simply did not exist in the form we know. Children were integrated into the labour of the household from a very young age. A girl of 6 might be tasked with minding a younger sibling, while her mother worked the garden. A boy of 7 might be sent to watch geese or pigs in the common pasture, ensuring they did not stray. These were not punishments. They were contributions, and the child making them understood their contribution to be real and necessary, because it was. This is not to romanticize child labor, which was frequently dangerous and sometimes lethal. Accidents involving farm animals, agricultural tools, millstones, open fires, and unstable rooftops appear in the coroner's rolls of medieval England with a frequency that speaks to the physical hazards of a world in which small people worked alongside large machines and large animals without modern safety protocols. But it is to say that the texture of a medieval child's day was woven into the fabric of the household's survival in a way that gave children a sense of genuine purpose within their family and their community, even as it denied them the particular freedoms that later generations would come to regard as the birthright of childhood. So the boy guides the oxen, the man follows the plough. Behind him, perhaps, the wife or an older daughter follows with a basket, picking out stones from the newly turned earth and tossing them to the edge of the strip, or breaking up the large clods of clay with a wooden mallet because the soil must be fine and broken enough for seed to find purchase in it. This work of breaking clods is called harrowing when done with the harrow, a frame of wood set with iron or wooden tines that is dragged across the ploughed ground after the ploughing is done. But before the harrow comes, the manual work of the clod breakers, and it is work that does not sound like much until you have stood in a cold English field in early spring and tried to break clay clods apart with a mallet for 4 hours, at which point the soreness of the wrists and the particular ache across the shoulders, and the way the cold and the damp come up through the soles of your feet are things you will not easily forget. The whole operation of medieval agriculture is collective in ways that modern farming is not. The plough team is one example. The harvest is another, and perhaps the most dramatic. When the grain is ready, and the readiness of grain is judged not by a calendar date or a reading from a digital moisture meter, but by looking at it, by feeling it between the fingers, by biting a grain of it and assessing the resistance and the taste. Skills accumulated over a lifetime of seasonal observation. The whole village mobilizes. The harvest must be completed quickly, because rain falling on cut grain can ruin it, and the window between ripeness and ruin is narrow, and the weather in England is not to be trusted. Every available person comes to the field. Old people, pregnant women, children old enough to carry sheaves. All of them come, and they work from the first light of morning until the light fails, and they work the next day and the next until the field is cleared and the grain is safely stacked in sheaves and eventually threshed and stored. The harvest is the most physically demanding period of the agricultural year, and it is also one of the most socially vivid. There is a quality of festivity, even in the exhaustion, a communal energy that comes from shared purpose and the particular relief of watching the stored food accumulate, knowing that another winter can be faced. There are harvest songs. There is ale brought to the field in mid-morning and mid-afternoon. There is the particular camaraderie of people working alongside one another in an outdoor space under a late summer sky. The companionship of effort that is one of the things most easily lost to modern individualized labor and most viscerally present in collaborative physical work. The woman, back at the cottage, tends the fire, feeds the younger children, perhaps takes the older daughter to the kitchen garden to check what is coming up. The leeks, the onions, the cabbages, the parsley, the herbs that flavor the pottage and also serve as medicine when needed. The kitchen garden is a woman's domain in most accounts of medieval village life, and the women of medieval Britain were gardeners of considerable skill and knowledge. They knew which plants repelled insects and which attracted bees. They knew which herbs stopped a fever and which eased a bellyache and which, in sufficient quantity, could end a pregnancy. Knowledge that was passed not through books, since most village women could neither read nor write, but through oral tradition, from mother to daughter, from wise woman to apprentice, in the long, unbroken chain of practical knowledge that constitutes most of human history. The monastery is different. While the village family wakes to the demands of the land, the monks of a Benedictine monastery. And by the 12th century, there are hundreds of monasteries scattered across Britain, from the wind-swept island communities of the north to the great abbeys of the south. Wake to the demands of God, and these demands are, if anything, more precisely calibrated than any harvest schedule. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, and still the foundation of monastic life in medieval Britain, divides the day into 8 canonical hours, periods of communal prayer that structure every waking moment and several sleeping ones. Matins, which in many traditions begins in the deep middle of the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning. Lauds, which follows it in the hour before dawn. Prime, at the first hour of daylight. Terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline follow at intervals through the day and into the evening. The church bell marks each office. The bell cannot be argued with. A monk sleeps in the dormitory, a large communal sleeping hall where the brothers rest on individual pallets, separated from one another by low wooden partitions in some houses, not at all in others. The dormitory is cold. The rule does not prohibit cold, and in many monasteries, the only heated room is the calefactory, the warming room, where a single fire burns for a portion of each day, and the monks are permitted to come and thaw their hands before returning to their unheated duties. The church itself is unheated. The scriptorium, where manuscripts are copied, is unheated. The cloisters are exposed to the weather. The monks of medieval Britain lived in their bodies in a way that required a kind of ongoing stoicism that is difficult to appreciate from the inside of a heated building. When the bell rings for matins, the monks rise in the dark, dress in their habits, the long wool robes belted at the waist that mark their order, black for Benedictines, white for Cistercians, and file through the dark cloister into the church for the night office. Their footsteps echo on stone, their breath mists in the cold. The church is lit by candles, and their light is warm but limited, a small warm darkness rather than any real illumination. The monks chant the psalms. The Latin syllables rise and fall in the precisely calibrated rhythms of plain song, the Gregorian chant that is the musical heartbeat of medieval religious life. They have done this before. They will do it again. The psalms cycle through the week in a pattern that means a monk who has been in his order for a decade has sung each psalm hundreds of times, knows them not as text but as sound, as physical memory, the words and melodies so deeply embedded in the body that they continue, even when the mind is elsewhere, even when the monk is fighting exhaustion in the small cold hours before dawn, even when the candle in front of him blurs and the stone beneath his feet seems to pull at him with the weight of sleep. After matins and lauds, the monks return to the dormitory for a few more hours of sleep before prime, the office of first light. This broken sleep, rising in the deep of the night for prayer, then returning to rest, seems to modern ears like a peculiar form of self-inflicted insomnia. But it is worth noting that recent research into sleep patterns before the industrial era suggests that so-called segmented sleep, sleeping in two distinct periods separated by an interval of wakefulness, may have been the natural human sleep pattern for most of history, and the insistence on a single unbroken 8-hour sleep may itself be a relatively modern expectation, shaped by artificial light and industrial schedules, more than by any biological imperative. The monks, in other words, may not have found their interrupted nights as punishing as we imagine. The hour between the two sleep periods was sometimes used for quiet reflection, for personal prayer, for the particular quality of thought that comes in the dark and the silence of deep night. With the arrival of daylight, the monastery begins its working hours. After prime comes chapter, Shemshaz, the daily assembly of the community in the chapter house, a vaulted room off the cloister, where the abbot addresses the monks, where confessions are made and penances assigned, where the business of the monastery is conducted, and the deaths of brother monks and benefactors are commemorated. Medieval monasteries maintained elaborate systems of prayer for their dead, for the monks who had died within the community, and for the lay donors and patrons whose gifts sustained the institution and who had purchased, in exchange, the promise of perpetual prayer for their souls. A great monastery might be praying for hundreds of souls at once, keeping careful records in its necrology, its book of the dead, so that the anniversary of each death was observed with appropriate liturgical commemoration. After chapter, the monks go to their assigned tasks. In a large monastery, these tasks are varied and substantial. There are monks who work in the scriptorium, the writing room, copying manuscripts. The monasteries of medieval Britain are not merely places of prayer. They are, in many periods and regions, the primary repositories of literacy and learning, the places where the texts of antiquity and the writings of the church fathers are preserved, copied, and transmitted. A skilled monastic scribe might spend the greater part of his working life in the scriptorium, hunched over a slanted writing desk, carefully copying text with a sharpened quill onto sheets of prepared parchment. Animal skin, usually calfskin or sheepskin, stretched and scraped until it is thin and smooth, then cut to the appropriate size and ruled with a stylus to keep the lines straight. The work of the scribe is not simply mechanical reproduction. A skilled scribe corrects errors in the text being copied, notes variants, occasionally adds his own marginal commentary. The scholarly conversation that takes place in the margins of medieval manuscripts is one of the most intimate records we have of how the people of the period actually thought about what they were reading. He also adds rubrication, the red ink headings and initial letters that mark the beginning of sections, and leaves spaces for the illuminators, who will later add the decorated capitals and miniature illustrations that make the great illuminated manuscripts of the period among the most beautiful objects ever created by human hands. The monk in the scriptorium is cold, his fingers are stiff. Good quality ink does not flow as freely in cold weather, and some scriptoria kept small braziers of coals nearby, not for the monk's comfort, but for the inks. The preparation of ink is itself a craft of considerable complexity. The most common medieval ink is iron gall ink made from oak galls, the small round growths produced on oak trees by certain wasps, which are crushed and soaked in water or wine to extract the tannic acid, then combined with iron sulfate and a binder, such as gum arabic. The resulting liquid starts pale brown when first written, but darkens over time as the iron oxidizes, which is why medieval ink is typically a deep brown, black on old parchment. Getting the proportions right, not too thin, which produces pale writing that won't endure, not too thick, which clogs the quill, is a learned skill, and the monastery's supply of good ink is a matter of genuine concern, since a batch gone wrong means wasted parchment and wasted time. The quills are made from the primary flight feathers of geese, preferably taken in spring, when the feather is at its best, and they must be hardened. A process called dutching, which involves pushing the quill into hot sand or curing it in a particular way, and then cut and shaped with a small knife, the penknife, whose name in the English language records this long, vanished purpose. The angle and exact geometry of the quill's cut determines the character of the writing it produces, and an experienced scribe sharpens his own quills to his own specifications, the way a modern craftsman might calibrate his own tools, producing a consistency of stroke that becomes identifiable and individual across thousands of pages. Paleographers, scholars who study medieval handwriting, can often identify the hand of a specific scribe across multiple manuscripts, sometimes spanning decades, the handwriting changing gradually as the person ages just as any human hand changes. The letters slightly less certain in old age, the ascenders perhaps a little thinner, the pace of the writing perhaps a little slower. The great illuminated manuscripts, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, the Luttrell Psalter, the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, represent one end of a vast spectrum of manuscript production, the supremely luxurious end where the finest materials and the most gifted artists were applied to objects intended for royal chapels and cathedral high altars and the private devotions of the very wealthy. But at the other end of the same spectrum are the humble working manuscripts produced in ordinary monastic scriptoria for practical use. Computus manuscripts for calculating the date of Easter, medical reference books consulted in the infirmary, liturgical books worn from daily use and repaired until the parchment is nearly transparent. These humbler manuscripts are in many ways more revealing of daily life than the great luxury books. They show the corrections, the crossings out, the marginal notes added by later readers, the drawings in the margins made by bored scribes during long winter afternoons, tiny pictures of rabbits, monsters, knights, and faces that survive 8 centuries to surprise and delight the archivist who turns a page and finds them there. Other monks work in the garden. The monastic kitchen garden, like the village kitchen garden, is a place of practical cultivation. Vegetables, herbs, medicinal plants. But the great monasteries also maintained orchards, fish ponds, and in many cases, substantial agricultural operations managed by lay brothers, the conversi, who were members of the monastic community, but performed the physical labour rather than the liturgical duties. The great Cistercian monasteries of the north of England, Rievaulx, Fountains, Byland, became in the 12th and 13th centuries extraordinarily productive agricultural enterprises, running large flocks of sheep on the Yorkshire moors and selling wool in sufficient quantities to make the abbots significant figures in the wool trade and the abbeys wealthy enough to build churches of soaring stone that still stand, now roofless and open to the sky, as some of the most haunting ruins in England. The infirmary is another domain within the monastery, tended by the infirmarian, a monk with knowledge of medicine and the care of the sick. Medical knowledge in medieval Britain is a mixture of things that seem to us simultaneously sensible and baffling. Classical theory inherited from Galen and Hippocrates. Practical herbal knowledge accumulated over centuries. Religious understanding in which illness was sometimes interpreted as spiritual imbalance or divine trial, and genuine empirical observation of what worked and what did not, accumulated across generations of monastic healers. The great monasteries were among the few places in medieval Britain where a sick person could reliably receive sustained care. The monastic infirmary was not a hospital in the modern sense. There was no surgery, no anesthesia, no understanding of germ theory. but it was a place of relative cleanliness, regular feeding, warmth, and the kind of attentive observation that is, even without modern medicine, not nothing. People survived things in monastic infirmaries that they would not have survived elsewhere. In the towns, the day has a different character again. Medieval Britain is not yet an urban civilization. The majority of its population lives in rural villages throughout most of the period. But it has towns, and those towns are alive and complicated and loud in the hours of daylight. London is the largest, growing through the medieval period from a substantial town to something approaching a genuine city, its population swelling particularly after the Norman conquest of 1066, brings administrative centralization and commercial investment. By the early 14th century, before the catastrophe of the Black Death reduces it dramatically, London may hold somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people. Small by the standards of later centuries, but large enough to constitute a genuine urban world with its own rhythms and its own hierarchy and its own distinctive problems of crowding and sanitation and public order that are quite unlike anything encountered in the village. London's streets are full of the sounds of trade, the cries of the street sellers who circulate through the city, selling from baskets and trays and carts. Their calls announcing hot pies, fresh fish, ripe strawberries, new rushes for the floor, sweet lavender, sharp knives, and 100 other things. The street cries of medieval London are recorded in musical settings of the 13th and 14th centuries, polyphonic compositions in which the vendors' calls are woven together in contrapuntal patterns that preserve, in something close to their actual form, the sounds of the medieval city at its most animated. But there are dozens of other towns of significance: York, Winchester, Bristol, Norwich, Lincoln, Exeter, each with its own economy, its own guild structure, its own markets and fairs, and peculiar local customs. The town wakes early, the market does not wait. In a world without refrigeration, fresh food must be sold and bought on the day it is available, and the rhythm of the market town is therefore tightly bound to the rhythm of dawn. Farmers from the surrounding countryside have already been on the road for hours by the time the market opens. They rose before dawn, loaded their carts, and drove or walked in through the town gates, which in many medieval towns were literally gates in a literal wall, closed at night and opened at first light. The road into town at first light is a road of movement. Carts loaded with grain and produce. Women carrying baskets of eggs or live poultry. Drovers pushing cattle slowly along the verge, the animals reluctant, steam rising from their backs in the cold morning air. A tinker with his pack. A pair of friars walking quickly, their grey habits dusty from the road. A young man with a rolled piece of cloth under his arm, going to show it to a merchant. A peddler with a tray of small goods, pins, thread, ribbons, buckles, cheap knives that he has carried from the last town and will carry to the next. The road into the medieval market town is a river of commerce, and the town at its centre is where that river pools and swirls and distributes itself before flowing out again. The physical layout of a medieval town is worth understanding because it shapes the experience of everyone moving through it. There is a main street, typically, that runs through the town between the principal gates, wide enough for carts to pass one another, with some difficulty. Off this main street, lanes and alleys thread between buildings that press close on either side, their upper floors sometimes projecting over the street below. The jettied stories of medieval timber frame construction that give old English town streets their characteristic narrowing overhead, the sky reduced to a strip of grey between the overhanging rooftops. The buildings are of wood and plaster, generally with tiled or thatched roofs, and they are close to one another, close enough that a fire in one building is a catastrophe for the street, which is why the records of medieval town life include a depressing regularity of devastating urban fires. Entire streets reduced to ash, before the bucket chains and leather pipes of the fire wardens could make any impression on the blaze. The streets are not paved in most medieval towns, except perhaps the main thoroughfare, which may have a surface of cobblestones or broken stone that provides some purchase in wet weather. The mud of a medieval market street in rain is something that contemporary urban experience offers no equivalent for, not the contained mud of a country walk that can be managed with the right boots, but the deep, churned, organic mud of a thoroughfare through which cattle and horses and carts and several thousand pairs of feet have been moving, a mud that contains the accumulated waste of both animals and people since the last time it rained hard enough to wash any of it away, and the smell that rises from it on a warm day is something that no amount of historical scholarship fully prepares the imagination for. The wearing of pattens, wooden-soled overshoes that raise the foot several inches above the surface of the street, is not a fashion eccentricity, but a practical response to the reality of the ground underfoot in any weather short of a hard freeze. The market itself is a spectacle of sensory intensity that almost defies description from the vantage point of a modern supermarket. The noise is immediate and total. The bellowing of cattle, the high complaint of penned sheep, the squealing of pigs, the rapid negotiation of vendors calling prices, the counter-calling of buyers, the barking of dogs threading between legs and cartwheels, the shouts of children running errands, the creak of cart axles, the clang of the smith's hammer from the forge at the edge of the market square. The smells are overwhelming. Fresh bread and roasting meat from the cookshops and bakeries that set up around the perimeter. The sharp ammonia of animal waste. The smell of fresh turned earth on muddy boots and cartwheels. The sweeter smell of cut hay and grain. The salt and smoke of the fish seller's stall. The sharp herbal notes from the apothecary's booth. The butcher has been at work since before dawn, slaughtering and dressing animals in the shambles. The butchering district that most medieval towns designate to a particular street or area, partly for practical reasons of waste management, and partly because the blood and entrails of butchery are recognized as having an effect on the sensibilities of the neighbors that is best managed by concentration in one place. The butcher's trade is skilled and physically demanding. A good butcher knows anatomy not from books, but from the inside of 1,000 bodies. He knows where to cut to find the joint, how to peel back the hide in long clean sheets, how to extract the organs without contaminating the meat, how to separate the carcass into portions that will sell and portions that will be rendered for tallow, or given to the dogs, or saved for the cooking of stocks and broths. His hands are strong and stained and permanently scarred by the small daily cuts that come with knife work, and his relationship to death is pragmatic and unsentimental without being cruel. He does not particularly enjoy the killing, but neither does he dwell on it, and the animal he is breaking down at 4 a.m. in a cold stone shambles will be sold at a fair price by 7, and the family that buys it will be fed by it. And in the economics of medieval life, this transaction is simply part of what keeps the world turning. The baker has also been up since before dawn, because bread in a medieval town is not merely sustenance. It is the primary caloric foundation of almost every person's diet across every class and region. The bakers of medieval Britain operated under strict guild regulations that controlled the quality and weight of the bread they produced, and the assize of bread, the periodic legal setting of bread prices and weights, was one of the most consistently enforced pieces of commercial legislation in medieval England, because bread was one of the things a government could not afford to get wrong. When bread became scarce or expensive or adulterated with cheaper fillers, people rioted. The records are full of it. The baker's oven is a large dome of clay and brick that must be heated for hours before the first loaves go in. Fuel, wood in most cases, is expensive, and the most efficient use of the oven's long heat is to run multiple batches through it as it gradually cools. starting with the items that require the highest temperature and working down to items that can be baked at lower heat as the oven cools toward the end of the firing. The first batch might be the fine white manchette, bread made from refined wheat flour, the bread of the wealthy. The second batch, the denser, darker bread made from whole wheat or a mix of grains. Later, as the oven cools further, perhaps hard biscuits or the drying of herbs. The baker's day begins in absolute dark and ends, if he is fortunate, in the mid-afternoon. His hands flour white and his face permanently reddened from hours beside a hot oven. His back aching from the long-handled peel. The flat wooden shovel used to slide loaves in and out of the oven's mouth. The guild system that governs the baker and the butcher and most other trades in a medieval town is one of the period's more fascinating social inventions. A private regulatory body that is also a mutual aid society, a professional association, a social club, and in many cases, a religious fraternity. To practice a trade in a medieval town, you needed to belong to the relevant guild, and belonging to the guild meant submitting to its rules, paying its dues, serving its apprenticeships, and participating in its collective life. The guild regulated quality. A baker caught adulterating his bread or selling short weight could be dragged through the streets in a cart with the offending loaf tied around his neck. A punishment designed to combine physical discomfort with public humiliation in proportions sufficient to discourage repetition. The guild also provided for its members in hardship, contributing to the support of widows, the care of sick members, the training of orphaned apprentices. The guild chapel, maintained in the parish church or sometimes in a dedicated foundation, is the religious centre of the guild's collective life. The guild hires priests to sing masses for its dead members, maintaining the perpetual prayer for departed brothers, that is the spiritual economy of the medieval period in miniature. The living praying for the dead benefiting from that prayer. The whole community of the guild stretching across the boundary of death into an ongoing relationship of mutual support. The feast days of the patron saint of the guild's trade are celebrated with particular solemnity, Crispin and Crispinian for the shoemakers, Eloi for the smiths, Luke for the painters. And the feast itself, the annual guild dinner, is an occasion of considerable festivity and expense, at which the finest cloth is worn and the finest food is served, and the accounts of the past year are settled, and the officers for the coming year are elected. The annual cycle of the guild mirrors and reinforces the annual cycle of the church calendar, so that the working year and the religious year are wound together inseparably. The feast days marking the transitions of the professional year, just as they mark the transitions of the spiritual one. This integration of the sacred and the commercial is not hypocrisy, but simply the normal texture of medieval life, in which the boundaries between the religious and the secular are much more permeable than later centuries will make them. The merchant who lights a candle to the Virgin before a voyage is not performing a religious observance separate from his commercial life. The voyage and the prayer are part of the same reality, the same understanding of a world in which divine power is operative in commerce as in everything else, and the proper response to that power is acknowledgement and petition and the regular practice of gratitude when things go well. The apprenticeship system is worth pausing over, because it represents one of the medieval period's most significant approaches to education and professional formation. A boy, and it is almost always a boy, though female apprentices existed in some trades, might enter apprenticeship between the ages of 7 and 14, depending on the trade and the period. He is bound by contract to his master for a term of years. 7 years is common, though the term varies, during which he lives in the master's household, eats at the master's table, sleeps in the master's workroom or hall, and receives training in the trade in exchange for his labour and his obedience. He is paid nothing, or almost nothing, in cash, but he is housed and fed and taught, and at the end of his term he is a journeyman, a trained practitioner who can hire out his labor for wages. And eventually, if he saves enough and can afford the guild fees and can produce a satisfactory masterwork, he becomes a master himself, with the right to take his own apprentices and conduct his own business. The apprentice's day is long. He rises early to prepare the master's workshop, laying the fire, setting out tools, perhaps fetching water from the conduit or the public well, because fresh water in a medieval town is not piped into every building, but must be fetched from a limited number of sources and carried, and the carrying of water is one of the day's constant background tasks, repeated multiple times by multiple members of the household, so unremarkable that it barely appears in the written record except in its absence. In the moments when the well runs dry, or the conduit is broken, or the water carriers go on strike, which they occasionally do, he assists the master through the working day, observing, imitating, gradually being trusted with more of the actual skilled work as his competence grows, running errands between customers and suppliers, sweeping out the workshop, maintaining the tools, and at the end of the day, after the work is done, eating whatever the household eats for supper, before sleeping wherever the household puts him, which is frequently on the floor of the workshop among the tools and materials of the trade. The craftsman in the town is also connected, often surprisingly deeply, to a world beyond the town's walls. The raw materials of medieval craftsmanship travel remarkable distances before they arrive at the bench. The iron the blacksmith works may have come from the forest of Dean or from imported Scandinavian or Spanish ore. The dyes the cloth dyer uses, woad for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow, are grown locally in some cases and imported at considerable expense from the Mediterranean in others. The spices in the apothecary's jars have travelled from India or the Spice Islands via Arab merchants to the Italian trading cities of Venice and Genoa, and thence over the Alps or by sea to England. The silk in a wealthy woman's dress has passed through the hands of perhaps a dozen merchants on its way from Chinese looms to the chest of a merchant's wife in York or Bristol. Medieval Britain is not isolated. This is one of the period's most persistently misunderstood aspects. The caricature of the medieval world as a provincial backwater, cut off from global commerce by its own ignorance and the difficulty of travel, is simply wrong. England is, from the 11th century onward, one of Europe's most significant sources of raw wool and raw cloth, and its merchants travel to the great fairs of Champagne and the ports of the Hanseatic League and the trading cities of Flanders and Burgundy to conduct business that makes some of them very rich indeed. The staple, the system by which English wool exports are channeled through a single designated port, generating tax revenue for the crown, is one of the medieval state's most effective fiscal instruments, and its administration involves a sophisticated bureaucracy of customs officers and merchants and royal officials that is anything but provincial. The merchant who travels is a figure of medieval life who deserves more attention than he typically receives. The long-distance merchant, the man who travels the roads between London and Boston in Lincolnshire and the great cloth fairs of Flanders, lives a life that is physically demanding, financially risky, and administratively complex in ways that rival anything in modern business. He carries letters of credit rather than cash where possible, because carrying large amounts of specie on the roads of medieval England is an invitation to robbery. He relies on a network of correspondents, factors, and agents in the towns he visits. He keeps accounts, either himself, if he is literate, or through a hired scribe, of his transactions, his debts, his credits, his stock. He is subject to the laws of multiple jurisdictions and the customs of multiple towns, and navigating this complexity requires a practical legal knowledge that has nothing to do with formal legal training. The roads he travels are not, in most cases, paved roads. The Roman road system has survived in fragments. There are stretches of Roman road in England that remain in use throughout the medieval period, and where they exist, they are the best roads available. their stone surfaces still relatively sound after centuries. But most of the road network is unpaved track, and its quality varies enormously with the weather and the season. In summer, on a dry year, the roads are passable. In autumn, after the harvest traffic, they can be deeply rutted. In winter, in some regions, they are nearly impassable, churned by the hooves of animals and the wheels of carts into something like porridge. The maintenance of roads is a legal obligation in the medieval period. Property owners along a road are responsible for its upkeep in front of their land. But enforcement is inconsistent, and the actual condition of most medieval roads reflects this inconsistency. Travel by road is slow, walking pace roughly, for most goods traffic, 2 to 3 miles an hour for a loaded cart on a good road, considerably less in bad conditions. A rider on horseback, unencumbered, might cover 30 miles in a day on a good road in summer. A merchant with a pack train of horses loaded with cloth might cover 15. A peasant walking to the nearest market town and back might walk 20 miles in a day. Arriving home in the evening with aching feet and whatever he managed to sell and whatever he managed to buy and the particular satisfaction of a transaction completed. The medieval world is not a small world. It is a world where scale is experienced physically, in the body, in the hours of travel, in the weight of the pack and the distance of the horizon. The life of a craftsman in a medieval town is not always dramatic. This is perhaps its most important characteristic. It is mostly the repetition of skilled physical work in a confined space, day after day, season after season, with the rhythm of the church bells marking the hours and the rhythm of the guild's calendar marking the weeks and months. But within that repetition there is a kind of mastery, a knowledge so deeply embodied that it ceases to be knowledge in any conscious sense and becomes instead a way of inhabiting the world. The carpenter who has been making joints for 30 years does not think about the angle of his chisel. The weaver who has been working her loom since childhood does not count the threads. The smith who has been shaping iron since he was an apprentice does not calculate the temperature of the metal. He knows it by its colour, by the sound it makes when struck, by the way the hammer feels in his hand when the iron is at the right temperature to yield. And this knowledge is not in his head, but in his hands and his arms and the particular muscles of his back and shoulders that have been shaped by decades of hammering into a body that is specifically, precisely, irreversibly a blacksmith's body. The great hall of a medieval manor is another world entirely, physically closer to the village and the market town than the monastery, but socially as distant from the peasant's cottage as the cottage is from the monastery's scriptorium. The hall is where the Lord lives and governs, and the shape of life in a medieval hall is shaped by the particular demands of lordship and by the social theatre that lordship requires. The Lord is not simply wealthy, he is an administrator, a judge, a military commander, a landlord, a patron, and a host, all in one, and his hall is the physical expression of all these roles simultaneously. The Great Hall is a large room, typically the most important room in the manor complex, with a high roof and large windows, larger than those of ordinary buildings, since the display of light and space is itself a form of power, and a central hearth that burns all day and much of the night, not for the warmth of the family, but for the warmth of the household, the extended community of servants and retainers and visiting guests and petitioners and officers who constitute the social world of the medieval lord. The lord is not simply wealthy, he is an administrator, a judge, a military commander, a landlord, a patron, and a host, all in one, and his hall is the physical expression of all these roles simultaneously. The Great Hall is a large room, typically the most important room in the manor complex, with a high roof and large windows, larger than those of ordinary buildings, since the display of light and space is itself a form of power, and a central hearth that burns all day and much of the night, not for the warmth of the family, but for the warmth of the household, the extended community of servants and retainers, and visiting guests and petitioners and officers who constitute the social world of the medieval lord. The administration of a medieval estate is a substantial and ongoing operation. The lord holds his land, not in modern freehold ownership, but in a complex set of feudal tenures, owing military service upward to a greater lord, or ultimately to the king, and collecting rents and labour services downward from his own tenants and villeins. The obligations run in both directions, and their management requires constant attention. The steward keeps a running account of what is owed and what has been paid, what services have been performed, and what remain outstanding. The manorial court, which meets several times a year, is the administrative mechanism through which disputes are resolved, obligations enforced, land transfers recorded, and the customs of the manor maintained. The lord presides over this court, or his steward presides in his absence, and the proceedings are recorded in the court rolls that survive in considerable numbers and provide historians with a remarkably intimate view of village life, conflict, and social organization. The manorial court rolls contain, among their thousands of recorded entries, an extraordinary range of human behavior. A man fined for allowing his pigs to root in a neighbor's strip. A woman charged with brewing ale without a license. A family recorded as having transferred their tenancy to a son on the father's death, with the appropriate entry, fine paid to the lord. A dispute between two neighbours over the ownership of a disputed piece of land, resolved by the testimony of the oldest men in the village, who can remember the customs of previous generations. A man found guilty of taking wood from the lord's forest without permission. A serious offence in a world where the management of woodland is a significant economic concern, and the lord's rights over his forest are jealously guarded and vigorously enforced. The forests of medieval Britain are not wilderness in the modern sense. They are managed landscapes, subject to forest law, a separate royal legal code covering the management of the deer and the vert, the vegetation, that was extended dramatically by the Norman kings and remained a powerful and sometimes oppressive legal framework throughout the medieval period. The forest law protects the game, the deer especially, for the hunting pleasure of the king and his nobility, and its enforcement means that a hungry peasant who poaches a deer from the royal forest faces penalties ranging from fines to mutilation to hanging, depending on the period and the severity of the offence. The distinction between the lord hunting as a sport and the peasant hunting as a necessity is one of the medieval period's most instructive examples of how power shapes the meaning of the same act. Hunting itself, as practiced by the medieval nobility, is not simply recreation. It is military training, maintaining the riding skills and physical fitness that warfare requires. It is the management of the landscape, since the controlled hunting of deer and boar regulates populations that would otherwise cause significant agricultural damage. It is a social institution, an occasion for the display of the horsemanship and courage and knowledge of the chase that mark the aristocratic male as legitimate within his class. And it is, not least, a genuine source of pleasure. The medieval hunting treatises, of which there are several, convey an enthusiasm for the chase that is entirely convincing. The authors writing with expertise and excitement about the behavior of game animals and the proper conduct of hounds that can only come from people who genuinely love the activity they are describing. The hawk on the lord's wrist in the morning is another instrument of this aristocratic culture of the outdoors. Falconry, the training and flying of hawks and falcons to catch game, is one of the most technically demanding pursuits in medieval life, requiring years of study and practice to understand the behavior of the birds, to train them to return to the fist, to distinguish the characteristic flight styles of different species of hawk and the quarry they are suited to pursue. The hierarchy of the birds is as precise as the hierarchy of the people who fly them. The gyr falcon for the king, the peregrine for the earl, the sarker for the knight, the lanner for the squire, the merlin for the lady. And the language of falconry has left deep traces in English, with words like hoodwink, haggard, cadger, and at the very limit of its etymology, the word quarry itself, all derived from the vocabulary of the mews and the field. The lord of even a modest manor household employs a small staff of servants whose days are organized around his needs and the needs of his household. The steward manages the estate's finances and administration. He keeps the accounts, oversees the work of the tenants, collects rents, ensures that the obligation services owed by the villeins are performed, and handles the correspondence that flows between the lord and the world beyond his demesne. The marshal oversees the horses and the stable, because horses in the medieval world are expensive luxury items as well as practical tools, and their care is correspondingly specialized. The kitchen staff, the cook and his assistants, the spit boys, the kitchen maids, work from early morning to produce the meals that are the primary ceremonial events of the Lord's Day. Meals in the Great Hall are not merely the consumption of food, they are performances of hierarchy and order. The hall is arranged around the high table, the table on the raised dais at one end of the room, where the lord and his family and honoured guests eat, and the lower tables that extend down the length of the hall where the household and lesser guests are seated. Where you sit in the medieval hall is a precise statement of your social position, and the seating arrangement is maintained with a care that reflects the seriousness with which medieval society takes the ordering of its hierarchies. The salt cellar, the large, often elaborate container that holds the salt, is placed on the table as a marker of precedence. To sit above the salt is to sit in the honoured upper portion of the hall. To sit below the salt is to sit in the lower portion, and the expression has persisted in the English language as a trace of that long-vanished social world. The food at the Lord's table is substantially different from the food in the peasant cottage, in both quality and quantity. The Lord eats meat regularly, roasted, stewed, in pastries, in elaborate-made dishes, while the peasant family eats meat rarely, and when they do, it is likely to be preserved meat rather than fresh, or the cheaper cuts and offal that wealthier households do not want. The Lord's bread is fine and white, the peasant's is coarse and dark. The Lord has access to spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, imported at considerable expense from the Mediterranean and beyond, used both to flavour food and to preserve it, and to signal the wealth of the household through the conspicuous expenditure of these costly ingredients. The peasant seasons his pottage with salt, if he is lucky, and with whatever herbs grow in the garden. This is not to suggest that peasant food was uniformly bad. A good cook with access to fresh vegetables, fresh bread, ale, and the occasional piece of salted pork can make food that is nourishing, flavourful, and deeply satisfying, and the medieval period, for all its very real privations, was not a period of universal starvation. Famines happened. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was catastrophic, killing perhaps 10 to 15% of England's population. But they were exceptional catastrophes rather than the normal condition of rural life in most periods. In ordinary years, most people ate enough, and some ate well. The cook in the Lord's kitchen is a person of considerable skill and status within the household hierarchy. Medieval cooking is more complex than its reputation suggests. The great recipe collections of the period, texts like the form of Curie compiled in the late 14th century by the master cooks of Richard II, describe dishes of considerable sophistication, requiring an understanding of how flavours combine, how heat changes texture, how the sauce should be thickened, how the colour of a dish communicates its quality to the diner. Sauces, in particular, are a medieval speciality. The great tradition of French and English sauce making begins in the medieval kitchen, driven by the dual requirements of flavour and preservation. since a well-seasoned sauce could mask the signs of meat that was not entirely fresh and could in some cases actually slow its deterioration. The cook works in a kitchen that is either a separate building from the hall, fire being the constant enemy of wood and thatch construction. Keeping the kitchen separate reduces the risk of the entire manor burning if the kitchen catches, or in a room at one end of the hall, always in proximity to heat and smoke, and the controlled chaos of food production at scale. The spit is turning by late morning in preparation for the midday meal. A boy, the spit boy, turns it by hand, a task that is as tedious as it sounds and that occupies his entire morning. The medieval period will eventually devise mechanical spit-turning devices, including the remarkable smoke jack, which uses the rising heat of the fire itself to turn a fan that turns the spit, a piece of practical engineering that anticipates the turbine by several centuries. But in the earlier medieval period, the spit turns by hand, and the hand belongs to a boy, and the boy turns and turns and turns, watching the meat brown and the fat drip into the pan below and the fire glow. And the morning passes in the warm fog of the kitchen with the smell of roasting meat filling every corner of the room. The women of the Lord's household have their own sphere of work and authority. The lady of the manor is not an idle figure. She manages the domestic side of the household, the linens, the supplies of food and drink, the oversight of the female servants, the care of the children and the sick, the reception of female guests, and in many cases, the administration of the estate when the lord is absent, which in the medieval period is often, since lords are called to military service, to royal courts, to parliament, to the management of distant properties, and to the long journeys that characterize the life of a mobile aristocracy. The lady left in charge of a medieval castle or manor house during her husband's absence manages a household that is not merely domestic, but administrative. She hears petitions, manages accounts, oversees repairs, and in some documented cases, leads the defense of the castle against armed attack. The noblewomen of medieval Britain are not the passive figures they are sometimes made to appear in romantic fiction. They are active, literate in many cases, skilled in the management of complex households, and possessed of legal rights, though considerably fewer than men, that included the ability to inherit land, bring lawsuits, and negotiate contracts. The great correspondence collections of the period, the Paston letters of 15th century Norfolk, the letters of the Stoner family, the Plumpton correspondence, are full of the voices of medieval English women conducting the practical business of their families with clarity, intelligence, and no small amount of impatience with the obstacles placed in their path by law and custom. Education in medieval Britain is a patchwork of opportunity and exclusion, shaped entirely by class, gender, geography, and the particular circumstances of the individual. The cathedral schools and later the universities, Oxford established in the late 12th century, Cambridge early in the 13th, provide a formal Latin education for boys and young men intended for the church or for administrative careers. The curriculum is the trivium and the quadrivium of classical learning: grammar, rhetoric, logic, then arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, a framework of knowledge derived from the classical world and filtered through centuries of Christian commentary, and the debate that happens within this framework in the great lecture halls of Paris and Oxford and Bologna is anything but static or parochial. The scholastic philosophers of the 12th and 13th centuries, Abelard, Anselm, Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and Berain Seurat, are engaging with questions of logic, ethics, theology, and natural philosophy at a level of sophistication that belies the caricature of the medieval world as intellectually dormant. But the university is for men. Women are excluded from formal higher education throughout the medieval period, though individual women of exceptional circumstances. The great abbesses, the female mystics, The women of the highest nobility find ways to acquire remarkable learning through private tutors, through monastic connections, through the simple application of intelligence to the books that pass through their hands. Hildegard of Bingen, writing in the 12th century, produces works of theology, music, and natural history of a scope and originality that would be remarkable in any person of any century. Julian of Norwich, writing in the late 14th century, produces in her Revelations of Divine Love what is perhaps the most psychologically acute and theologically original piece of English language, mystical writing in existence, and she does it as an anchoress, a woman who has voluntarily enclosed herself in a small cell attached to a parish church in Norwich, receiving visitors through a window, tended by a servant, living a life of extreme physical restriction in exchange for a freedom of the inner life that her writing makes vividly present across 6 centuries. Medicine, as practiced in medieval Britain, operates within a theoretical framework that is almost entirely absent from modern clinical practice. The 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and the 4 qualities, hot, cold, moist, dry, constitute the foundational vocabulary of medieval medical thought, derived from classical antiquity and elaborated through centuries of medical commentary. Health is understood as the proper balance of the humours. Illness is understood as their imbalance. Treatment is therefore aimed at restoring balance, which might involve dietary modification. Herbal medicines believed to have the appropriate heating or cooling qualities, bloodletting or purging, depending on the diagnosis. Within this theoretical framework, that is in many respects simply wrong, there is also embedded a substantial body of empirical observation and practical knowledge that works. Medieval physicians and surgeons understand wound care in ways that anticipate modern practice. The importance of keeping wounds clean, of removing foreign matter, of supporting the body's healing with adequate food and rest. The herbalists know that certain plants have genuine medicinal properties. Willow bark for fever and pain, which contains the compound that will eventually be synthesized as aspirin. The surgeons of the medieval period perform operations, the removal of cataracts, the setting of broken bones, the draining of abscesses, the amputation of gangrenous limbs, that require genuine anatomical knowledge and genuine manual skill. The survival rates are not those of modern surgery, but they are not zero, and the best medieval surgeons are people of real competence, working at the limit of what their tools and their knowledge permit. Pilgrimage is one of the distinctive features of medieval religious life, and one of the period's most significant forms of long-distance travel. The pilgrim who sets out for Canterbury, to the shrine of Thomas Becket, murdered in his cathedral in 1170, and almost immediately established as one of the most powerful saints in England, is not primarily a tourist, though the journey shares with tourism a quality of departure from ordinary life and encounter with the extraordinary. The pilgrim is traveling with a specific spiritual purpose, the accumulation of merit, the fulfillment of a vow made in a moment of crisis, the hope of miraculous cure, the desire to be physically present at a place made sacred by the suffering and holiness of a martyr. Chaucer's Canterbury Pilgrims are a satirical portrait of this phenomenon, but they are recognizable as a phenomenon because pilgrimages were a genuine, common, and popular institution, participated in by people of every social class, from royalty performing acts of public penance to elderly villagers walking to the nearest local shrine to ask for relief from rheumatism. The pilgrim's journey has a social dimension that is captured perfectly in Chaucer. The road enforces intimacy. You walk with whoever is going your way. You share accommodation at the pilgrim hostels and hospitals that are established along the major pilgrimage routes. You hear stories. You tell stories. The artificial barriers of social class are somewhat softened by the communal experience of the road, though they are never entirely dissolved. The knight still expects deference. The miller still dominates his space. But the mixing of people that pilgrimage produces, the bringing together in a single journey of the knight and the ploughman, the prioress and the wife of Bath, is one of the medieval period's genuinely distinctive social experiences, and the literature it produced is among the greatest in the English language. The afternoon in the village settles into the particular tempo of sustained labour. The morning's urgency slightly softened, the hours between noon and the declining of the light filled with the ongoing tasks that constitute the background of agricultural life. The animals need water, the garden needs weeding, the children need watching, the fire needs feeding. The cloth that was begun on the loom last week needs more hours of weaving. The fence that is beginning to lean needs attention before it falls entirely, and the sheep get out. In the medieval village, almost nothing is bought that can be made, and almost nothing is discarded that can be repaired, and almost no task is postponed that can be done today, because the margin for error in a subsistence household is narrow. A fence that falls and lets the sheep onto the neighbour's grain strips is not an inconvenience. It is a legal matter, a financial loss, potentially a feud. A fire that goes out on a cold night and cannot be relit, because the flint and steel are wet or the tinder is damp, is not an annoyance but a genuine emergency. Medieval people are attentive to their tools and their resources in a way that reflects this reality. The maintenance of the household is not a background concern, it is the central project of daily life. Weaving and spinning are among the most constant of the domestic tasks, and they are almost universally the province of women in medieval Britain. The distaff, the stick on which raw wool is wound before spinning, becomes so strongly associated with women's work that it gives its name to the female line of descent in heraldry and genealogy. A woman spins while she walks. She spins while she watches the children. She spins while she waits for the bread to come out of the communal oven. The drop spindle, a weighted spindle that is set rotating and then dropped. The weight pulling the twisted fibre into thread can be used one-handed, which is precisely its virtue in a world where a woman's hands are never entirely free. The spinning wheel arrives in England in the 13th and 14th centuries, bringing somewhat greater efficiency to the production of thread. But even with the wheel, the production of enough thread to weave a single piece of cloth is a vast investment of time, which is why cloth in the medieval world is expensive enough to be itemized in wills and bequeathed to loved ones as a significant inheritance. The loom is a somewhat larger operation. It requires set-up time and a dedicated space and a degree of concentration that makes it less portable than spinning. But a skilled weaver can produce cloth steadily over the course of a day, the rhythmic passage of the shuttle back and forth through the warp threads creating a sound that becomes part of the household soundscape. The thump and swish of the beater compacting each row of weft. The click of the heddle as the shed changes. The cloth produced at the domestic loom is not fine. It is plain and sturdy, the kind of fabric that makes working clothes and bed coverings and the wrappings of newborns. Hard-wearing and washable, and exactly suited to the lives of the people who make and use it. Fine cloth, the expensive woolen broadcloths, and the imported silks, and the dyed and finished luxury fabrics, comes from the professional cloth industry, the weavers and fullers and dyers and shearmen and merchants who make the cloth trade the most significant sector of the medieval English economy, the basis of fortunes and the foundation of the commercial revolution that begins to transform Britain's economic life from the 12th century onward. The afternoon also belongs, at its edges, to community. The medieval village is not a collection of atomized households going about their private business in isolation. It is a deeply communal organism in which the lives of its members are entangled by proximity, by shared land use, by the legal structures of the manorial system, and by the social structures of the parish church. The relationship between neighbours in a medieval village is one of the most thoroughly documented aspects of medieval life in the records of the manorial courts, which adjudicate the endless small disputes, boundary transgressions, debt, unpaid obligations, damaged crops, straying animals that arise from the intimacy of communal living. The records of these courts are not primarily a record of violence and disorder. They are a record of a community managing its own conflicts through institutional means, adjudicating disagreements, imposing small fines, recording agreements, and maintaining the social fabric that allows people who depend on one another's cooperation to go on cooperating even after they have annoyed one another. The alehouse is one of the locations where community happens informally. Ale in medieval Britain is produced domestically, often by women. The alewife, the brewster, is a figure present in almost every village, and it is sold from private homes in a system that is regulated by the assize of ale. In much the same way, bread is regulated by the assize of bread. The alehouse is not a purpose-built structure in many cases, especially in smaller villages. It is simply a house where ale is being sold, indicated to passers-by by the ale stake, a pole with a bush or bundle of greenery tied to it, stuck out above the door. People come to drink and talk in the afternoon, after the most intensive labour of the day. Women come too, perhaps more often than later social history would suggest, since the prohibition of women from public houses is largely a later development in English social life. The conversation is about crops and weather and the Lord's new demands and the priest's recent sermon and who has been summoned to the manorial court and what happened at the market in the nearest town. It is ordinary, it is intimate, and it is, in its way, the living social tissue of the community. The monastery's afternoon is given over to work and study. The Benedictine rule divides the monk's day between the opus Dei, the work of God, the liturgical prayer, and the opus manuum, the work of the hands, the manual and intellectual labour that sustains the community. After the midday office of sext and the midday meal, the monks read in the cloister, or work in the garden, or the scriptorium, or the kitchen, or the infirmary, according to their assignments. The reading that takes place in the cloister during the afternoon is Lectio Divina, the slow, contemplative, meditative reading of Scripture and the Church Fathers that is not the rapid, information-consuming reading of the modern world, but something closer to dwelling with a text, turning it over, sitting with a single sentence or paragraph for minutes or even hours, allowing it to unfold its meanings gradually, like a flower in slow motion. Lectio Divina is a practice still maintained in some monastic communities today, and practitioners describe it as one of the most radical departures from the reading habits of the contemporary world. In an age of rapid scrolling and fragmented attention, the discipline of reading one page very slowly for an hour is both difficult and many find, surprisingly, restorative. The monastic library is one of the most remarkable institutions of the medieval world. The great libraries of the major English monasteries, Canterbury, Durham, Glastonbury, Bury St. Edmunds, contained hundreds or thousands of volumes, representing an extraordinary investment of time and labour and material resources. Each book is the product of months or years of work. The preparation of the parchment, the copying of the text, the binding of the quires into a volume, the crafting of the binding boards. The books are not books in the sense we are accustomed to. They do not have printed text, uniform page sizes, title pages, or ISBN numbers. They are unique objects, each one bearing the marks of its specific scribe, its specific illuminator, its specific moment of production, as individual as handwriting, which they are. To open a medieval manuscript is to be in physical contact with the hands and eyes of a specific person who lived a specific life in a specific place 800 years ago, and this intimacy across centuries is one of the most vertiginous experiences available to anyone willing to seek it out. The monks who maintain the library take their responsibility seriously. Books are chained to the shelves in some libraries, not to keep the monks from stealing them, but to ensure they are returned to their proper places. Since a book misplaced in a medieval library is a book effectively lost in a collection without printed catalogue numbers and alphabetical spines. The lending of books to visiting scholars and to the monastery's own monks for private reading is carefully recorded. The repair of damaged books, rebinding, regluing, patching torn pages is a specialized skill. The monastic librarian, the armarius, is a person of considerable authority and expertise within the community. Evening comes early in the medieval winter and late in the summer, and this variation in the length of the day has profound effects on the structure of daily life, in a way that modern life, lit artificially throughout the year, no longer experiences. In December, useful daylight in England lasts perhaps 7 or 8 hours. In June, it lasts 17. This means that the winter day is radically compressed. There is simply less time for outdoor labour, less time for travel, less time for the market and the field and the road. Winter is therefore a time of relative quiet in the agricultural village, a time when the most demanding physical labour is impossible, when the frozen ground offers nothing, and when the long dark evenings are spent close to the fire, mending tools and harness, spinning and weaving, telling stories. The telling of stories in medieval Britain is not a marginal entertainment. It is a central cultural institution. The oral tradition is alive and vigorous in a world where most people cannot read, where books are rare and expensive, where the primary medium of shared culture is the spoken word. The storytellers, the gleemen, the jongleurs, the bards of the Welsh and Scottish traditions carry the cultural inheritance of their communities in their memories, in the thousands of lines of verse and narrative that they have memorized and can perform on demand. They know the stories of King Arthur and his knights, the legends of Beowulf and the Norse heroes, the tales of the saints whose relics are venerated in nearby churches, the local legends of strange happenings and marvels and ghosts that cluster around the particular landscape of their region. They perform for the Lord in the great hall and for the villagers at the alehouse and at the fairs, and their performances are not passive receptions but interactive events, in which the audience responds, interrupts, calls out, and participates in the shaping of the story as it unfolds. The parish church is the centre of community life in a sense that goes well beyond the religious. The church building is one of the few structures in the village large enough to accommodate the entire community at once, and it is used not only for religious services, but for assemblies, for the storage of community records, for the shelter of travellers, and as a space for the social events. The church ales, the festivals, the midsummer celebrations that punctuate the agricultural year. The parish priest is a figure of enormous practical importance in the life of his community, though his learning and piety vary enormously across the medieval period and across the geography of Britain. At his best, the medieval parish priest is a man of genuine education, theological knowledge, and pastoral sensitivity, tending his flock through the full range of human experience from baptism to deathbed, knowing the names and situations of every family in his parish, available for counsel and comfort and intercession. At his worst, and the satirical literature of the period is full of examples, he is ignorant of the Latin, he mumbles through the Mass, keeps a concubine, charges for sacraments that are supposed to be free, neglects his pastoral duties, and is more interested in the revenue from his glebe land than in the spiritual state of his parishioners. The reality in most parishes falls somewhere between these extremes, and the relationship between the medieval village and its priest is a relationship with all the complexity of a long and forced intimacy. Affection, exasperation, dependence, occasional contempt, and a mutual embeddedness in the life of the community that makes the relationship ineradicable regardless of its quality. The priest knows things about the village that no one else knows, because he hears the confessions of its inhabitants, and the seal of confession means that this knowledge goes with him to his grave, unspoken, a great silence at the centre of his pastoral role. The interior of the medieval parish church is not what the visitor to an English country church typically sees today. The Reformation's stripping of the altars, the destruction of images, the whitewashing of walls, the removal of rood screens and statues and painted glass, has transformed the typical English church from something intensely visual and sensory into something austere and spare. But before the Reformation, the parish church was covered in colour. The walls were painted with scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin and the saints. The Last Judgment spread across the chancel arch, warning the congregation at every service of what awaited them after death. The statues of the saints stood in their niches, painted in vivid colours, sometimes dressed in donated clothes, surrounded by the candles that worshippers lit before them as they said their prayers. The altar was dressed in fine fabric and precious metalwork. The east window, where the parish could afford it, glowed with painted glass. The Mass, celebrated at the high altar every Sunday and on feast days, is a ceremony of extraordinary theatrical power in the hands of a reasonably competent priest. The vestments of different colours marking the liturgical season, the clouds of incense filling the air with the particular smell of sacred space. The bells rung at the elevation of the host, the moment when the bread is held above the altar and the congregation falls to its knees, and those who are close enough and have good enough sight believe they are seeing the body of Christ. The central claim of Catholic Eucharistic theology, made visible and present in a particular village church on a particular Sunday morning. Most of the congregation does not receive communion except at Easter. They are present not as participants in the communion, but as witnesses of the sacrifice. The mystery enacted on their behalf at the far end of the church, the Latin words just audible, the ceremonies just visible, the meaning available to those with the theological background to understand it and present as sacred power even to those without it. The church ales are significant. These are fundraising events in which the parish brews a quantity of ale and sells it, using the proceeds for the maintenance of the church fabric or for the relief of the parish poor. They are social events of genuine festivity. They include music, dancing, games, and the kind of relaxed communal celebration that is the other side of the medieval world's relentless physical labour. The festivals of the medieval church calendar are the medieval equivalent of public holidays, and there are many more of them than modern workers receive. The medieval year contains approximately 52 Sundays, on which no agricultural work is supposed to be done, plus a large number of feast days and saints' days that add up in a typical year to somewhere between 40 and 60 additional days of rest from labour. The exact number varies by region and period. Some feast days are observed locally, but not universally, and the enforcement of the no-work rule on feast days is variable, but the overall picture is of a year significantly punctuated by enforced rest, far more so than any modern working year in Britain, where the statutory minimum holiday entitlement is 28 days. This should not be interpreted too romantically. The days of rest from agricultural work were not days of leisure in the modern sense. They were days on which different kinds of work were done, particularly the domestic and craft work that the agricultural schedule normally displaced. A woman spinning on a feast day is resting from the field, but she is not resting in the sense of sitting in the garden with a glass of wine and a novel. But the rhythm of the medieval year does contain a kind of breathing, a patterning of effort and release that the continuous grinding of modern work schedules sometimes lacks. The church in the medieval village is also the place where the community marks the great transitions of individual life: baptism, marriage, last rites. And these occasions have their own elaborate ritual forms that structure the community's collective experience of birth, love, and death. Medieval baptism takes place as soon as possible after birth, ideally within a day or two, because infant mortality is high and the unbaptized soul is theologically in a precarious position, and the urgency of getting the child safely into the church is real and emotionally charged. The baptism is a community event. The godparents, the relatives, the neighbours who come to witness and celebrate, and the feast that follows is an occasion for the household to display its generosity and the community to reinforce its bonds. Medieval marriage is complex, and its complexity is worth appreciating. The canonical legal position of the medieval church is that a valid marriage requires only the freely given consent of the two parties. The exchange of vows in the present tense constitutes a binding marriage, regardless of whether it takes place in a church, before a priest, or with witnesses. This means that clandestine marriages contracted in private without witnesses and without official church involvement, are legally valid and create all the legal consequences of marriage, including the legitimacy of any children. This is simultaneously a protection of individual consent. No one can be forced into marriage against their will, since an unwilling consent is no consent, and a source of endless social confusion, since without witnesses, the existence of a prior clandestine marriage is extremely difficult to prove or disprove when it later becomes legally relevant. The church courts of medieval England are full of cases in which one party claims a prior private marriage and the other denies it, and the court must try to determine the truth from the testimony of people, with strong incentives to misrepresent what happened in a private moment. The practical reality of marriage in medieval Britain is more varied than the theology. Among the nobility, marriage is a matter of property and alliance. It is negotiated by families, conducted through lawyers and diplomats, and the consent of the parties is real, but takes place within a frame of family expectation and pressure that makes genuinely free choice somewhat theoretical. Among the peasantry, marriage is also a practical matter. The joining of two households, the consolidation of land holdings, the creation of a cooperative unit capable of maintaining a viable agricultural operation. But the individual preferences of the parties carry somewhat more weight, simply because the social stakes are lower and the supervision of family interest is less intense. The death of a person in a medieval village or town is a community event. There is no modern machinery of death, no hospital, no funeral home, no professional intermediaries between the dying person and their community. The dying person dies at home, surrounded by family and community members who participate directly in the process of dying, tending the body, saying the prayers, witnessing the last moments, performing the rituals of farewell. The priest is called to administer the last rites, the anointing of the body, the hearing of the final confession, the viaticum, the last communion that is meant to sustain the soul on its journey from this world. These rituals are taken seriously, and the failure to receive them, dying suddenly, dying away from home, dying in a state of unresolved sin, is a source of genuine fear and anxiety in medieval life, in a way that is difficult to recover from the perspective of a more secular age. The body is prepared for burial by the family, washed and wrapped in a shroud that is often the person's best linen, and the burial takes place in the churchyard as soon as possible. Again, because of practical considerations, preservation of a body in warm weather without refrigeration is not possible, And because the soul's journey to its next destination is understood to begin with the committal of the body to the earth. The grave is in the churchyard, which means that the physical landscape of the village incorporates its dead in a way that modern cities and towns typically do not. The churchyard is where children play and where the market sometimes spills over and where the village gathers on Sundays. And the graves of parents and grandparents and neighbours are visible on every walk past the church. And this visibility of the dead is not considered morbid, but natural. The dead are part of the community, their memory maintained through prayer and commemoration, their names preserved in the parish records that the priest keeps in his church chest. The night comes down on the medieval village like something with weight. In a world without artificial light, darkness is total. Not the partial dark of a modern bedroom, with its ambient glow of screens and standby lights and street lamps filtering through curtains, but absolute darkness, the kind in which you genuinely cannot see your hand before your face. Let us pause here, in the middle of this quiet evening, and follow the year a little further. Because the day we have been living is a spring day, and the year contains other days, and some of those other days have a character so different that they might belong to an entirely other world. January in medieval Britain is a world of restricted motion. The roads, where they exist, are mud or frost. The fields offer nothing. The light is so reduced that the working day, measured in hours of useful outdoor illumination, shrinks to a fraction of its summer length. The cold penetrates, even inside the cottage with the fire going. The cold presses against the walls and comes up through the earthen floor and finds the gap in the shutter that was never quite properly fitted after the autumn storms. The breath mists in the room. The children stay close to the fire. The animals in the byre attached to the cottage. In many peasant homes, the family lives at one end of a long building and the animals at the other, sharing warmth in both directions. Make the particular sounds of livestock in winter, the slow, rhythmic sounds of animals conserving energy and waiting. The food stores are being watched carefully. The grain in the storage pit must last until the next harvest. The salted meat from the autumn slaughter, the martinmas killing when animals that could not be fed through the winter were slaughtered and their meat preserved, is rationed a little every few days, enough to flavour the pottage but not enough to eat freely. The dried peas and beans, the stored root vegetables softening in their piles, some of them beginning to rot, needing to be sorted before the rot spreads. The ale, carefully maintained, the new batch brewing in its pot beside the fire. These are the resources against which the family measures the winter, and the measuring is not anxious in the way that financial anxiety is anxious. It is simply practical, the way you take stock of provisions before a journey, calibrating need against supply, adjusting consumption to match what is available. The winter tasks are the tasks of maintenance and preparation. Tools are repaired and sharpened, harnesses mended, baskets are woven from the osiers and hazels cut in autumn and stored for this purpose. Wood is split. The loom is worked more hours each day, the weaving that could not be done in summer when fieldwork claimed all available time, now taking priority in the long evenings. Children are taught, not in school, in most cases, but by parents and grandparents, in the informal transmission of practical knowledge that is the primary form of education for most of the population. A grandfather showing a grandson how to weave a fish trap. A mother teaching a daughter the properties of the herbs in the kitchen garden. Which ones to harvest at what stage of growth. Which ones to dry and how to store them. Which ones to use fresh and which to simmer slowly in oil to extract their properties. This oral transmission of knowledge is not a lesser form of education because it lacks books and classrooms. It is the form in which most human knowledge has been transmitted for most of human history, and it works. The Black Death that arrives in England in 1348 and 1349 is not part of any ordinary year, but its aftermath shapes the late medieval world so profoundly that it must be mentioned even in a description of the texture of daily life. The Black Death kills approximately a third to a half of England's population in its first visitation, and the repeated outbreaks that follow it through the late 14th and 15th centuries mean that the population of England in 1450 is substantially lower than it was in 1300. This catastrophic reduction of population has effects on daily life that are paradoxical. The survivors inherit the land and the resources of the dead, and the scarcity of labour that follows the mortality gives the peasants who remain a bargaining power they have never previously possessed. Wages rise, serfdom weakens. The villains who before the plague were legally bound to their lord's land find that the lord, desperate for labour, is willing to accept rents in cash instead of labour services, and that the threat to leave for another lord who offers better terms is a credible threat for the first time. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, with its extraordinary demands for the abolition of serfdom and the equal ownership of the earth, is the political expression of a social transformation that the plague made possible. The poor of England, diminished in numbers but emboldened by their suddenly increased value, insisting on a renegotiation of the terms on which they inhabit the world. The candle, made from tallow, the rendered fat of cattle and sheep, which is cheaper than beeswax but also smokier and less pleasant, is a luxury used sparingly. Firelight is the primary source of indoor light after dark, which means that the useful radius of evening activity is the warm circle of the hearth, and beyond that circle, the room dissolves into shadows. In the monastery, the evening offices mark the passage of the night's early hours. Vespers at sunset, then compline, the final prayer of the day, after which the monks proceed in silence to the dormitory, the great silence having fallen, the day's speech concluded until morning. Compline is a particularly beautiful office in the Benedictine tradition, its antiphons and psalms gathering the day's experience into a final act of trust and surrender. The community of monks placing themselves and the night's darkness into the hands of the God they have been serving all day through prayer and labour and study. The Nunc Dimittis, the Canticle of Simeon, sung at Compline, the old man's prayer of peaceful release, has been sung at the close of the Christian day for 15 centuries, and the melody rises in the cold stone church and finds the vaulted ceiling and falls back down through the candle smoke, and the monks stand in their stalls and let the sound carry them, and the night outside the church windows is very dark, and the stars, on clear nights, are extraordinary. In the great hall, the evening meal is the social and ceremonial climax of the day. The torches are lit, pine torches or cresset lamps burning oil or tallow, and their light is warm and flickering and gives the whole hall a quality of animation, of movement, of something slightly alive. The high table is set with the household's best plate, silver or pewter depending on wealth, and the food is brought in courses, each announced by the marshal and carried from the kitchen by a train of servers. Entertainment may accompany the meal. A household minstrel playing a lute or a pipe, a jongleur performing acrobatics or conjuring tricks, a storyteller recounting episodes from the romance of the moment. After the meal, the tables are cleared. In a great hall, the tables are often boards laid on trestles and can be quickly dismantled, and the floor cleared for dancing if the mood is festive, or the company may sit by the fire in the lower hall, while the lord and his favoured guests withdraw to the solar, the private upper room that is the family's retreat from the communal life of the hall. The music of medieval Britain is a world in itself. The instruments, lute, harp, rebec, hurdy-gurdy, pipe, tabor, psaltery, produce a sound that is not entirely recoverable, because no recording exists, and the notation systems of the period, while they tell us the pitches and sometimes the rhythms, do not capture the timbre of gut strings on instruments that no longer exist in their original form, or the particular resonance of a voice trained in a tradition of performance that died with the last person who practiced it. What survives in the manuscripts suggests a music of considerable sophistication. Polyphonic vocal music of the 13th and 14th centuries that is complex and beautiful. Secular songs in French and English and Latin. Dance music whose rhythms are still energetic and propulsive. Sacred music whose austere melodic lines achieve a quality of transcendence that even secular listeners find arresting. The dances of the medieval hall are communal and participatory in a way that later court dancing partly abandons. The carol, a circular dance in which participants hold hands and move together in a ring while one person sings the verses and the group joins in the refrain, is one of the most characteristic forms of medieval recreational dance, and its circular, inclusive structure is significant. The carol does not require a partner in the romantic sense, does not sort the participants into couples facing one another, but creates instead a moving community of people, joined by hands and voice. The circle of the carol is a shape that recurs across medieval festivity, in the Christmas mummers' play, in the maypole dance, in the ring of torches around a midsummer bonfire, and its recurrence suggests something about the value placed on communal coherence, on the expression of community identity through shared physical form. The winter evenings are long, and they are filled with talk. The fireside in a medieval hall or cottage is a gathering place that serves the function of both hearth and entertainment centre, and the quality of conversation that happens there, the storytelling, the riddling, the recitation of proverbs, the argument about theology and morality, and the behaviour of the neighbours, is the primary medium through which the culture of the period reproduces itself. The proverb collections of the medieval period are among the most revealing documents we have of popular attitudes and values. They record, in concentrated and memorable form, the practical wisdom of communities that have no access to the written word, the distilled experience of generations compressed into a single memorable sentence. Many of these proverbs survive in later English, the kernel of meaning inside them so durable that centuries of language, change and social transformation have not entirely eroded them. The riddle is another form that flourishes in medieval fireside culture. The riddling contests in Beowulf and in various other Old and Middle English texts are not mere literary devices, but reflections of a genuine entertainment tradition in which the posing of difficult riddles was both an intellectual game and a social performance, demonstrating the wit and learning of the riddler and the quickness of the listener. The Riddles of the Exeter Book, an anthology of Old English poetry, compiled in the late 10th century and preserved in Exeter Cathedral, include riddles whose answers range from the mundane to the theological, riddles whose double meanings play on the gap between the literal and the figurative, riddles whose humour is broad and whose wisdom is genuine, the voices in them as alive and various as any conversation. The peasant family retires earlier. There is nothing to stay up for in the dark, and morning comes early, and the body needs rest. The fire is banked, the coals covered with ash to slow their combustion, preserving them for the morning, and the family settles onto their pallets, close together for warmth, and the voices of the household fall quiet one by one, and the last sounds are the slow breathing of the sleepers, and the settling of the thatch above, and the distant sound of an owl hunting in the dark fields. It is worth pausing here, in this ordinary evening in medieval Britain, to consider what has been lost and what has been kept. The people of this world are not more virtuous or more spiritual or closer to nature than people of any other time. They are capable of cruelty, of greed, of violence, of pettiness, of injustice on both the large and small scale. The medieval period contains the Inquisition and the persecution of Jews and the brutal suppression of peasant revolts and the casual violence of a warrior aristocracy and the institutional cruelties of a system in which some people's labor legally belongs to other people. These things are real, and they matter, and they cannot be wished away by the warm light of nostalgia. There is also this. The people of medieval Britain die younger, on average, than people in contemporary Britain. A great deal younger. Infant and child mortality is so high that many parents do not allow themselves the full weight of attachment to a newborn child until the child has survived the first dangerous months and years of life. Not because medieval parents loved their children less, but because experience has taught them that love placed without reservation in a fragile small body is a love repeatedly broken, and the psyche finds ways to protect itself from what it cannot change. The coroner's rolls, the records kept by royal coroners of accidental and suspicious deaths, record the deaths of children with a matter-of-fact brevity that is itself a kind of testimony to how common such deaths were. A child drowned in a well, a child burned when it fell into the hearth fire, a child crushed by a cart, a child who simply did not wake one morning. The cumulative weight of these brief records, read across hundreds of pages of court document, is one of the most sobering historical experiences available to anyone who wants to understand the medieval world honestly. And yet people in medieval Britain also love their children, their spouses, their parents, their communities, their craft, their faith, their land, their particular view of a particular hill at a particular time of day, with a fullness and variety of feeling that the fragmentary nature of the historical record consistently underrepresents. The letters that survive, and they are rare and almost entirely confined to the literate upper classes, contain passages of such personal warmth, such specific tenderness, such clear-eyed recognition of another individual person, that the distance of centuries collapses entirely for a moment, and the person writing is simply a person, worried about the same things we are worried about, loving the same people in the same inadequate and irreplaceable ways. Margaret Paston, writing to her husband John in the 15th century from their Norfolk manor, combines practical business with the understated language of a long and trusting marriage. The way that genuine intimacy expresses itself, not in grand declarations, but in the assumption of being known. The shorthand of people who have shared enough of life that they do not need to explain their meaning at length. She is not a romantic figure. She is a busy, competent, practical woman, managing a complex household in difficult circumstances, and her letters are the letters of such a person, full of logistics and observation and the particular texture of a specific life in a specific place. And across 600 years, reading them, you know her. But the people of this world also have something, or rather, many things, that are easy to sentimentalize and hard to accurately name. They have time structured around something other than productivity. They have a relationship to the physical world, to the soil, to the weather, to the bodies of animals, to the weight of stone and the grain of wood. That is intimate and embodied and earned through years of attentive contact. They have a community life that, however difficult and conflicted, places them within a web of mutual obligation and shared ritual that gives individual lives a context and a meaning that pure self-sufficiency cannot provide. They have a cosmology, a story about where the world came from and where it is going, and what human life means within it. That, whatever its theological and historical problems, gives the days of the week and the seasons of the year and the great transitions of individual life a weight and a resonance that purely secular time does not automatically carry. None of this is an argument for returning to the medieval world. It would be absurd to suggest that the people of medieval Britain had better lives than people in contemporary Britain. They didn't, by almost any measurable standard, and the improvements in health and safety and freedom and material comfort that separate the two worlds represent genuine progress that only the most reckless romanticism would dismiss. But the fact that we cannot return does not mean we have nothing to learn. The pace of a medieval day, its attention to the small tasks, its responsiveness to light and season, its integration of work and prayer and community and rest into a single rhythm, contains something that many people in the contemporary world are searching for, sometimes desperately, in meditation retreats and digital detoxes and slow food movements and the various other attempts to recover a quality of presence and embodiment that the acceleration of modern life has somehow displaced. The question of what people in medieval Britain actually did all day is ultimately a question about the texture of human time. And the texture of their time was, above all else, physical. It was felt. It was rained on. It was warmed by fire and chilled by stone, and flavoured by the particular combination of smells that characterised each season. The dark earth smell of newly turned fields in spring, the warm grassy sweetness of haymaking in June, the wood smoke and wet wool and baking bread of autumn, the cold, clean, absolute silence of a hard frost in January. They lived inside the world rather than alongside it, and the world pressed back on them with a directness and a persistence that shaped their bodies and their habits and their understanding of what a day was for. There is one more thing worth saying, in the quiet of this evening, before the medieval world settles into its night. The people whose lives we have been following today did not know they were medieval. The word, of course, is ours, a term invented by scholars of a later period to describe an interval of history bounded on one side by the fall of Rome and on the other by the Renaissance, a period defined largely by its position between other periods, labelled by what it preceded and followed rather than by its own character. The monk in the scriptorium did not know he was a medieval monk. He knew he was a servant of God in the year of our Lord, 1140, in the monastery of St. Mary at Rievaulx, in the north of England, and that the psalm he was about to chant had been chanted since the time of David, and that the work on his desk would outlast him, and that the bell about to ring for vespers had rung this same hour every day of his adult life, and would go on ringing it long after he was gone. He was right about that. The bell still rings. Not the same bell, not the same monastery. Rievaulx stands now as a ruin open to the Yorkshire sky, its choir and nave and chapter house stripped to their bones by Henry VIII's dissolution and the centuries that followed. But the impulse it expressed, the marking of the hour, the call to pause, the insistence that time is not simply a medium in which things happen, but something that deserves to be inhabited with attention. That impulse has not entirely been silenced, even in a world of constant noise and constant motion and constant demand. The day in medieval Britain ends as it began, in dark, in cold, in the company of other breathing bodies, in the particular quality of trust required to close the eyes when the world outside is unknown and unlit, and the morning is not guaranteed. They trusted it anyway. They slept, and the morning came, as it does, as it has always done, with the slow return of light to a world that never stopped turning while they rested. A day was for surviving, a day was for working, a day was for praying. If you were a monk and attending to the prayers of others, if you were a priest and living within earshot of prayer, even if you were neither, since the parish church bell marked the hours and the religious calendar marked up the year and the great framework of the church year. Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter and Pentecost and the long procession of saints' days gave the individual day its place in a larger story. A day was for eating, which was not a given, and never could be taken for granted in a world where the harvest could fail, and the cattle could die, and the stores could run short before the spring. A day was for the company of other people, the family sleeping close, the neighbours at the well, the guild brothers at the meeting, the congregation at Sunday Mass. Because solitude in the medieval world is not a luxury, but a hardship, and isolation is not a retreat from social noise, but a vulnerability in a world where survival is collaborative. The craftsman in the town, the monk in the cloister, the farmer in the field, the lady in the hall, the child watching geese on the common, all of them are moving through the same broad day, the same light travelling from east to west, the same church bell marking the same canonical hours, the same seasons imposing the same ancient rhythms of effort and rest. Their lives are separated by vast inequalities of power and comfort and choice, but the day itself belongs to all of them equally. The same number of hours, the same quality of light, the same darkness waiting at the edges of evening. What connects them further is something harder to name. It is the quality of attention that physical work imposes. You cannot plough a field while also thinking about something else entirely. The body demands engagement, and the body's engagement imposes a kind of presence, a being here that is not always comfortable but is rarely empty. The monk chanting the Psalms for the 100th time is not absent from the words. He is in the words differently than on the first recitation, the way a familiar road is known in the muscles and the feet, rather than in conscious navigation. The knowledge deeper because it is no longer effortful. The weaver at her loom is not thinking about weaving in the way a beginner thinks about weaving. She is weaving, the distinction between the person and the action temporarily dissolved, the cloth growing under hands that have forgotten they are working. This quality, not mindfulness in the therapeutic sense, not meditation, but the simple absorption of the body and the attention in what is immediately in front of it, may be one of the things most genuinely difficult to recover in a world whose characteristic demands are the management of information and the navigation of attention across multiple simultaneous streams. The medieval world is not better at this. It is simply differently arranged, and its arrangement happens to produce, as a side effect of necessity, a kind of embodied presence in daily tasks that the contemporary world sometimes pursues as a goal without quite achieving it. In the great Benedictine monastery, the monk who will ring the bell for Compline is walking across the dark cloister toward the church. His sandals make a quiet sound on the stone. His hands are folded inside his sleeves against the cold. He knows exactly where he is going and exactly what he will do when he gets there, because he has been doing it for decades, and the familiar path across the familiar cloister under the familiar stars is not a diminishment of his life, but the very substance of it. The particular form his love has taken, expressed daily in the repetition of small faithful acts. The bell rung at the right moment, the psalm sung in the correct tone, the candle lit, the door opened, the cold endured, the darkness entered without fear. In the village, the last fire is banked. The last child has been quieted. The farmer is already sleeping, his body claiming the rest. It has earned from the day's work, and his sleep is dreamless or dreaming in ways he will not remember. And around him the cottage breathes with the slow breath of the sleeping, and outside the low door the fields lie still and dark under a sky impossibly full of stars, because there is no other light for miles, and the stars in a sky without competing light are not the faint, scattered suggestions we know from cities, but something overwhelming, something almost too much to look at. The whole burning architecture of the galaxy stretched from horizon to horizon above a dark and sleeping England. This is the world they lived in. This is the texture of their days. This is what was done and felt and known and left behind. Not in the grand gestures of history, not in the famous names and the famous battles and the famous dates, but in the daily accumulation of small faithful acts, repeated season after season and generation after generation, in the fields and the kitchens and the workshops and the churches of a world that is gone now and yet somehow persists, in the stones of old buildings and the rhythms of old words and the deep down memory of a body that knows what cold is knows what fire is, knows what it is to be awake before dawn in the dark, waiting for the light to come back. It always comes back. The bell rings in the monastery. The monks file into the church. The candles are lit. The Latin syllables of the Compline psalm begin to rise into the cold stone air, syllable by patient syllable, the way they have risen every evening for 500 years, the way they will go on rising for 500 more, long after the world that produced them has dissolved and been replaced by another world, and then another, each one certain of its own permanence, each one leaving behind its own particular texture of days. Rest now. The monastery is singing, the village is sleeping, the fire is banked against the cold. The stars are overhead, impossibly numerous, patient as stone, older than anything we have ever known how to name. The day is done.